Jazz funerals are a tradition as New Orleans is red beans and rice. But what if I said jazz funerals are not really jazz funerals? It's a provocative question. What most New Orleanians mean when they say jazz funeral is when a brass band escorts the body to the cemetery playing mournful hymns and sorrowful dirges. The return from the cemetery strikes a different mood, one filled with upbeat music and celebration of the deceased's life. Over the last 60 years, such funerals have come to be identified with the passing of music community members. But this was not always the case. To understand the origins of this cultural practice, we have to leaf back to page 2 of the August 31st, 1853 Daily Picayune newspaper. An article takes notice of the number of brass band funerals being held in the city. It defines musical selections, noting the bands play somber dirges on the way to the cemetery, followed by, quote, gay and lightsome airs on the way back. It sounds like a jazz funeral. The only problem is, jazz will not be played in New Orleans for another 60 years. That's why a jazz funeral is not a jazz funeral. The tradition is older than that. The 1853 story also mentions types of organizations holding musical funerals. Fire companies, militias, and charitable organizations were the marchers of the era. Firemen no longer parade as they once did, and there are no militias. But the charitable organizations are probably a reference to benevolent societies. These organizations were social safety nets for their members, helping them out in times of need and sickness. For a few pennies a week, the benevolent societies provided a powerful death benefit. The member's funeral was free. Some organizations even maintained tombs in cemeteries like Lafayette No. 2 in Central City. As part of the society ritual, a brass band was hired to escort the expired member to the hereafter. Though they existed before the Civil War, benevolent societies exploded on the landscape among freedmen at the end of Reconstruction. Many societies died out during the Great Depression and World War II. A few tenaciously held on. Today, the last of the 19th century societies, the 125-year-old Young Men Olympian Junior Benevolent Society, still functions, burying its members with music to the accompaniment of a brass band. Social aid and pleasure clubs have emerged through the years as successors to the societies of old. These clubs hold annual parades and often burials with brass band music for their members. Just as many African Americans adopted the European fraternal society model in New Orleans, some also took up European musical instruments. Newspaper accounts from the 1840s cite African American wind band musicians. These bands played from written scores, performing a variety of styles from quadrilles to mazurkas, as well as dirges at funerals. The dawn of jazz in New Orleans changed all of that. A little after the turn of the 20th century, improvising, gut-bucket blues-playing hornmen challenged the brass band status quo. Eventually, jazz came to dominate the New Orleans brass band idiom. Still, the old dirges, like Flee as a Bird and Garland of Flowers, remain staples of the band's funerary repertoire. The Dirty Dozen and Rebirth brass bands are groups that redefine the brass band for a new generation. Others followed, folding hip-hop, funk, rap, and rhythm and blues into the style. brass band musicians of 1853 would be shocked by the sound of early 20th century jazz. Likewise, stalwarts of the classic New Orleans jazz style sometimes dismiss the direction brass bands have journeyed. Still, this argument has a silver lining. New Orleans is still a place with a culture immensely interesting and diverse. Where else can we find ourselves having such a squabble? Through it all, the brass bands of New Orleans of every stripe march on. Maybe you'll run into one at a jazz funeral, if you still want to call it that. Reporting for the Times-Picayune, this is John McCusker.